Okay, hello. Thank you for joining us here for a shiur on Rabbi Lichtenstein's discussion of Kedushat Ha-Chodesh Ve-Ibbur Shana. We're going to try to get into the question of the Kedusha, of the nature. I mean, the book is about Kedushat Aviv, but the nature of sanctity and how it comes and what it is. So in this case, we're discussing it in terms of Rosh Chodesh, that the courts decide when the new moon should be. In some senses of it, it could either be the 30th day of a month or the 31st, and you have a whole process. That will be one thing. And then a little bit at the end, we'll talk about Ve-Ibbur Shana, the process where a court decides that they need a new month, another month of Adar, to make Pesach happen in the spring. So those are the overall topics. It'll be mostly about Kiddush HaChodesh, a little bit at the end about Ve-Ibbur Shana. And I want to make clear at the beginning that this is an article that takes up, I think, 50 pages in the Sefer. I will not be covering it all. So if you're listening and you see me and you think I missed some topic that Rabbi Lichtenstein had to have brought up, it's probably true. He probably brought it up, and I just, in the name of streamlining the presentation, have tried to focus on a central spine of the issue that he's discussing. So it starts with, the question is open with the fact that we know this, that the first mitzvah in the Torah, Hashem says to Moshe and Aharon, Ha-Chodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodeshim. That this, right, and that you, halachem Rosh Chodeshim, you decide when the new moon is, when the months are, in some sense. We have a Gemara in Beit so that people know that wonders why on a holiday we say Mekadesh Yisrael v'Hazmani. We put Yisrael first, and on Shabbat we only say Mekadesh HaShabbat. And if it's a Shabbat and a holiday, we say Mekadesh HaShabbat v'Yisrael v'Hazmanim. And the Gemara's answer is because the Jewish people, or somebody of the Jewish people, are the ones who set up the holidays. So the questions that Lichtenstein wants to entertain, and these are questions that he at the end, sadly, he didn't put the book together fully, so they took this article, they say in the introduction, primarily from his handwritten notes. So I think there's not a fuller and full conclusion here. But the questions he raises are that we'll think about, what's the connection between Jews and the courts and the holidays? Meaning, we know that the Chagim come about because of Kiddush HaChodesh. Who is being Mekadesh the Chodesh? Who is doing that? Rav Lichtenstein wants to know, is it Likud? Does it have to happen that way? So, for example, he'll talk about what if a Beit Din just doesn't do it? What'll happen then? So we'll get to that. And then, and what is it we're sanctifying? Right? So is it the holiday? Is it the month? Is it just the Rosh Chodesh? That's a topic that comes up as well. So, and from all of that, we'll get a sense of the possibilities. He's not going to nail it down because different Rishonim have different perspectives, and Aharon have different perspectives of these issues. But the question is, what is this thing of Kiddush HaChodesh, of sanctifying, that the Jewish people do? So, first question is, who is it who can be Mekadesh the Chodesh? A Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, Hashem says that Hashem is talking to Moshe and Aharon, so it's them. So who's the them? So the Ramban in the Hasagot to the Sefer Mitzvot, he thinks it's any three mumchim. Now, why? Any three people who have the special smicha that came from Moshe. Moshe's got the whole Torah. He ordained Aharon, and they have smicha. So the Ramban thought it was any three who have smicha in that way. Similarly, there's a Tosot elsewhere in Rosh Hashanah, which says that Kiddush HaChodesh is the type of a din, the type of a court case, kind of a mishpat, and therefore, but you can't have one for it. It's a special kind of a din, even though there are opinions that say that one person, a mumche larabim, an expert, could be allowed to do din on his own. Tosos think the idea of HaChodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodeshim, this month is for you a Rosh Chodesh, means it has to be the three. Now, as a side point, why three? It's Moshe and Aharon, it should be two. So Tosos agrees with Ramban that we say Ein Beit Din, or Tosos says Ein Beit Din Shakul, that there's no even Beit Din. So you might think to yourself, that shows that it's clear we're talking about a court, because theoretically, three mumchin could just be a standard. We need three of these experts, not necessarily a court. So the phrasing of Ein Beit Din Shakul maybe implies, no, it's a court. Rav Lichtenstein pauses to say, not necessarily, gives another example where we wonder about Ein Beit Din Shakul, that shouldn't this be even, where we know it's not a court. The topic doesn't interest me, the side topic. I only bring it up because it's an example of a characteristic of Rav Lichtenstein's that I think is worth remembering, is that when he's talking about an issue, he doesn't want to conclude that this is the case unless it's proven that it's the case. If it's a good possibility, he's happy to raise possibilities. He does. I think I skipped something, but he raises possibilities. He says, this is a possibility, but I can't prove it. Here's an example would be, he raises the possibility that maybe the calculation about the month is different than the actual declaring of the month. And maybe those have different rules. And he doesn't decide, doesn't conclude. That's an important quality, that quality of care, that quality of caution, of not jumping to conclusions, I think is worth noting when it comes up here from Lichtenstein. So he assumes, though, that we think of this as a Beit Din function. That would be the Ramban and the Tosfot. A weakness with that idea that he raises, Lichtenstein raises, is that if any three mumchin can declare the Chodesh, can declare Kiddush HaChodesh, wouldn't that mean the possibility that, in Tel Aviv, they'll think that it should be on the 30th day, and in Haifa, they'll think it should be on the 31st day, and won't that ruin the whole thing? So he thinks that's a real problem. So we'll get back to it in a second. But the Rambam's answer, the Rambam's view of this, takes it in a different way that solves that problem. The Rambam in Hilchot Kiddush HaChodesh says we need a Sanhedrin, or, because he knows the sources that talk about 3 judges being enough, he says those have to be 3 mumchin to whom the Sanhedrin gave permission. So he thinks, the Rambam seems to think that all the sources that talk about 3 mumchin mean 3 mumchin who have been appointed by or delegated by the Sanhedrin. But really, it's a Sanhedrin function. Now, if I say it's a Sanhedrin function, we're going to get there, we're going to have to think about what aspect of the Sanhedrin is this a function of. Right? So far we have the idea that maybe it could be 3 mumchin, just any random 3, not as a functioning as a court, but just 3 experts, and they have to be qualified. And 3 is a number that we pick because you have 3, people thinking about it. Or it could be that it's a court of 3, and that's as opposed to a court of 1. And now the Rambam's saying, no, he thinks it's a Sanhedrin issue, and now we have to figure out what kind of a Sanhedrin issue. So, right. So the Ramban knows this idea. The Ramban, who thought the 3 was good enough, said he thinks that once there was a Sanhedrin, and if there's a Sanhedrin, everybody agreed. Everybody voluntarily agreed not to do it unless the Sanhedrin told them to do it. Now that, Rav Lichtenstein says, that works in practice, but it doesn't tell us anything about the theory. Right? Meaning, it seems like in theory you can have all these people all over the place doing it. He doesn't answer that question. I don't know if he meant this, but there is an old joke about a physicist who sees some new invention and he can't figure out how it works. And he looks at it, and he says, I see how it works in practice. I have no idea how it works in theory. So I don't know if Rav Lichtenstein was referring to that old joke, but maybe. So that's how he leaves the Ramban on that question. Now, but when it comes to this idea of the Sanhedrin, what's this Sanhedrin role? So here, Rabbi Lichtenstein quotes his father-in-law, and this will come up later again. Rabbi Soloveitchik has a Kuntras Kiddush HaChodesh in one of the books. He says, the Sanhedrin functions in 2 different ways. One way the Sanhedrin functions is the highest court in the land. It's the final arbiter of Torah law. Whatever decisions come up, if they're appealed to the Sanhedrin, there are certain court cases, there are certain dinim that only come to the Sanhedrin or have to go to the Sanhedrin. That's one role of the Sanhedrin. But another role of the Sanhedrin, said Rabbi Soloveitchik, is that sometimes there's a decision that needs da'at kol Yisrael. It needs the assent or the agreement or the thoughts of the entire Jewish people. And there, the Rabbi Soloveitchik said, the Sanhedrin can function as the representative of the nation. 2 different things. And he says, Kiddush HaChodesh, he thinks, and Ibbur Shana aren't a din. Notice, Rav Lichtenstein had said earlier in the article, in the shir, that maybe it's not a din, although everybody seems to assume it's a din. Rabbi Soloveitchik was saying, at least for the Rambam, who brings in the Sanhedrin, it's not clear why you would need the Sanhedrin. He suggests, not a din, it's a decision of the Jewish people. And that when Hashem said to Moshe, Ha-Chodesh hazeh lachem rosh chodashim, it meant the Jewish people, not just Moshe and Aharon themselves. So Rav Lichtenstein pauses to note that you have 4 options of who controls time and who controls the holidays. First off, it's the Jewish people. That's an issue that Rav Lichtenstein is not, doesn't repeat again and again, but it's an important thing to know about, right? That the calendar, Hashem decided, that's the earlier There's a medrash, I don't remember if I quoted it, medrash where Hashem says to the angels, I don't know when the holidays are, it's up to the Jewish people to decide when the holidays are. So one element of this is that in our relationship with God, God gave us, either gave the experts among us, or the Sanhedrin among us, or us as an entire people, gave us the right to set our calendar and to shape our holiday time in our relationship with Hashem. So the four options that are listed quotes are any court of three mumchin, that most people would think, even if they're not a beit in a Sanhedrin, or the Jewish people embodied in the Sanhedrin. And then he notes that Rashi even speaks of chashuvei hador, maybe the leaders of the generation, not as the Sanhedrin, but as leaders. So you have all those possibilities. In here, in a context that I'm not sharing with you in the name of time, but I wanted to bring up this idea because it's an idea that I happen to have seen Rav Lichtenstein quote several times in his various writings. The Abnei Nezer is sure that when we say this is a function of the nation, we mean the Jews who live in Israel. Right? So that's an idea of that maybe the Jews who live in Israel constitute in some sense more of the Jewish nation than the rest of the Jewish nation. Not that they're not part of the nation, but that's the kahal we focus on. And there's a Gemara in Horayot, Gimel Amid Aleph. It happens to be that the day that I'm taping this is the day when Daf Yomi is learning Horayot Gimel Amid Aleph. So on Horayot 3a, the Gemara there says that only the residents of Israel are called a kahal, are called the essential nation, and that would be why Kiddush Ha-Chodesh, the sanctification of the new moon, has to be in Israel because that's the nation. That's a point that we're quoted other times, so I thought I didn't want to leave it out. So that's the first step of who the Beit Din is and what that means, and each of those have ramifications for what we're saying about the control of the calendar. What about, so he discussed, what about if you have a Beit Din and they decide not to, for whatever reason, they just don't, they aren't Mekadesh HaChodesh, and he quotes a Ritva who seems to think that maybe that they wouldn't have holidays then. And there's a whole discussion about between the two temples, between the destruction of the first temple and when the second temple was built. There's sources that suggest that there were no Jews in Israel, even though the Rambam seems to think we don't accept that Gemara that way. But it might be that without Kiddush HaKodesh of a Beit Din, of a court, that you would in fact not have actual holidays. What if there is? So, but what if you don't have a Beit Din? Right now, we're times. You might think the same thing, but we don't think that. So here, there are three main options. I'd always only known two, but let's see, these are the third. There's a tshuva of the Rimigash. The Rimigash was the Rebbe, was the teacher of the Rambam's father. He didn't leave a lot in writing, but he left. So he has a tshuva where he says, in this situation, it's Kidshu Shamayim. In this situation, Hashem takes back the right, as it were, to sanctify the new moon. And Hashem does it, and that's how we have it. So it's not clear how that works for Ve-Ibbur Shana, how that works for adding months into the calendar. It could be, Rothstein doesn't say this, the Rimigash doesn't say it. It could be that, again, once it's automated, once we have it in a fixed way, that Hashem is doing it for us. Something along those lines. But for the Rimigash, we'll point out later, I'm bringing it in now, for the Rimigash, the locus of the sanctification of the calendar has completely changed. Hashem gave it to us when he said that to Moshe and Aharon and Mitzrayim in Egypt. And then when we lost our Sanhedrin, because we went into exile, Hashem took it back. That's not the main view, but that's an interesting view of the Rimigash. The Rambam says we rely on the fixed calendar. We rely on the calculations. Lord talks about the calculations they do in their times, although really the calculations they do in their times are just to reveal what the tradition is, that there was a Rabbi Hillel in the time of the Gemara who saw this coming and he set up the calendar forever. So the Rambam says something like that as well, that we have a cheshbon, and that we figure out. Now in the Rambam's time, there were still arguments about it. In the Rambam's time, there were still situations where Jews in one place did their calculation and they thought that should lead to, let's say, Pesach being on a certain day, and Jews elsewhere in the world thought another way. Rav Sajid had that as well. Rav Sajid, I think, became the Gaon, the leader of the academy in Babel because of that. So the Rambam says we rely on the cheshbon, but on the calculation. Except he doesn't really mean it. We know he doesn't really mean it because in Hilchot Kiddush HaChodesh, he says it's the cheshbon of Bnei Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, of the Jews of Israel, ukviatam, and their decision. The Rambam sounds like, even though we have a fixed calendar, even though we calculate that calendar, it sounds like the Rambam means we're only calculating it to figure out what the people of Israel do. The problem is that there wasn't in the Rambam's time, and there isn't in our time yet, a formal body in Israel that's doing that. So what does the Rambam mean by that? Right? This is something that's puzzled many, many people for a long time. So Lichtenstein quotes a Shut Nefesh Chaya, who was a posek, a well-known posek in Poland in the 19th century. He said, and I feel like I heard this from a Rabbi of mine many years ago, but anyway, leave it for another time. Shut Nefesh Chaya, that's the name of it. Shut Nefesh Chaya pointed out that the Rambam elsewhere says, a different topic I can't get into now, but the Rambam elsewhere says that if all the rabbis, all the Chachamim of Eretz Yisrael, and the Shut Nefesh Chaya says even all the people of Eretz Yisrael gave smicha to somebody, that would return to being the original smicha. That's step one, a daring idea of the Rambam's that led to a whole conflagration in the 16th century about the smicha and recovering the smicha. Not our topic today, but that's what the Rambam says there. The Shut Nefesh Chaya says he thinks the Rambam means that every month in Israel, the people of Israel implicitly give smicha to three people, and whoever they are, and that's the cheshbon, and that makes the Kiddush Ha-Chodesh. Meaning the Rambam is not saying we're following the fixed calendar. It seems like the Rambam is saying, according to the Shut Nefesh, it definitely seems like the Rambam is saying this, that and the Shut Nefesh L'Chaya is saying it's the scholars of Eretz Yisrael are getting an implicit ordination for the purposes of the new moon, and he says the Meshech Chochmah says that as well. So that would mean that even in our times, when we talk about having a fixed calendar, the Rambam doesn't think we really have a fixed calendar. The Rambam really thinks what happens is that we, by a fixed calendar, know when the scholars in Israel make the Kiddush HaChodesh, do the Kiddush HaChodesh. The problem is the Avnei Nezer argued with this idea because the Rambam talks about being Mekadesh al pi ha'Re'iyah by witnesses coming, and being Mekadesh al pi ha'Cheshbon by a calculation. So it seems like there's a calculation there somehow. Rabbi Soloveitchik, similar idea, but from the opposite perspective, he said, remember, Rabbi Soloveitchik said the Sanhedrin was involved in this, not as a court, they were involved in this as a representative of the Jewish people. So Rabbi Soloveitchik, the Rav, said, when there's no more representatives of the Jewish people, then the people themselves do it. So when there are no mumchen, the Rav said, the power of Kiddush HaChodesh returns to the people. And how do the people mikadesh it? There's another innovative idea, not by declaring it, but just by what they do. Meaning, if you went to Eretz Yisrael and the Rambam's time, in our time, and all the hundreds of years between, and you go to shul the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh, people say it's Rosh Chodesh, and you go and you look at them on Rosh Chodesh, and they say I have Hallel, and they because they're counting again. He said that's it, that's good enough. So that's the Rambam. The Rambam seems to say we still have a Kiddush HaChodesh in some way. Two possibilities. The Ramban says, and it's hard to know what this means. I mean, we know what the Ramban means, but it's hard to know practically how that works. The Ramban thinks that this Rabbi Hillel in the Gemara was Mikadesh the Chodashim anticipatorily. That's a very complicated idea. It's not clear that works, but that's the Ramban's claim, because the Ramban doesn't accept this Rambam idea. He thinks that in the 3rd century or the 4th century, whatever it was, that he calculated the calendar in perpetuity, and he gave it the stamp of this. So Lichtenstein suggests now that is a question about the source of Kiddush, the source of the sanctification of a month. As for the Migash, like we said, it's Hashem doing it. For the Rambam, it's still the people of the land of Israel, either by ordaining certain people or by them doing it themselves. And for the Ramban, it seems to be that we don't have a direct Kiddush HaChodesh, and it means we have a lesser form of the calendar. Rabbi Lichtenstein thinks that even for the Rambam and the Migash, it's a lesser form as well. Because it seems like our ideal form is when witnesses come and judges and mumchin, experts listen, and they do it that way, and that might affect, although he doesn't get into it, it says it might affect the nature of our holidays as well. So that's the Kiddush HaChodesh part of our discussion of what it means to sanctify months, who does it, how they do it, what do we do now, the role of the Beit Din, the role of the Jewish people. So many different options for how we come to the calendar we have, and we as Jews control that calendar. When it comes to Ibbur Shana, when it comes to declaring a second month of Adar, so that Pesach will happen in the spring, so there the Rambam has, the Rav Lichtenstein points out, the Rambam doesn't talk about a mitzvah there. There are others who include this in the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh. The Rambam doesn't. The Rambam speaks about a mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh. And when he gets to Ibbur Shana, which is in the 4th chapter, so he didn't even bring it up, he says that the Beit Din, the court, will do it sometimes to adjust the seasons and the holidays and have them come out together. So Lichtenstein says it sounds very instrumental, that it's more a way to get to a goal than to a mitzvah. And he notes that when it comes to Kiddush HaChodesh, the court would say, the mumchin would say, the experts would say, mekudash, mekudash. They would declare it. But with Ibbur Shana, you don't do that. It's just the word goes out. There's a new month of Adar, but there's no formal process for it. So Lichtenstein is suggesting that Ibbur Shana isn't a sanctity issue. It's more of a fix account. It's like a bug in the calendar that we have the right to fix. But at least for the Rambam, that you don't have it in the same kind of a formal way. He notes, Gemara Sanhedrin says that Chizkiyahu, the king, prayed for forgiveness because he was one time Me'aber Nisan ben Nisan. Me'aber Nisan ben Nisan means, let's say, there's a whole discussion of the Gemara. I think they say that it was the first day of Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which theoretically could be the 30th of Adar. And he said, okay, let's add another Adar. But he wasn't supposed to. So the idea being that once we hit Nisan, this right to add a month goes away for that year. So if Chizkiyahu's praying for forgiveness, the Gemara makes it sound like the Jews that year gave the Korban Pesach on the wrong day. They offered the Pesach sacrifice, meaning it should have been Nisan. They should have done it that month. And instead, they did it, the next month. And Tosos says, but I don't understand. We have a principle when it comes to Kiddush Ha-Chodesh, to sanctifying the new moon. We say, even if the Beit Din got it wrong, even if they made a mistake, atem afilu shogegin, even if you got it wrong, you made a mistake. So Tosos says, that's only about the 30th or 31st. So that would mean it's very narrow. Even within the monthly sanctifications, only for those possibilities. But the Tzlach, who's the Noda B'Yehuda of Yechezkel Landau, he says in Brachos, he says, no, he thinks that Ibbur Shana is intercalation of the calendar, it's called. Putting in a new month is a whole different thing than Kiddush HaChodesh, and there's no idea of erroneous and it being okay even if they did it the wrong way. That means that Ibbur Shana is different. So Lichtenstein wonders about it. He says he hasn't seen specific sources. So if he hasn't, I certainly haven't. Right? He offers suggestions. He says, maybe, he sees sources that suggest it, but hint at it. He says, maybe that means that for Ibbur Shana, you wouldn't allow Chilul Shabbats. Meaning, if witnesses see the new moon on a Friday night, they're allowed to violate Shabbat, whatever the, not always, but whatever the circumstances are, they can violate Shabbat to go to the court and say, we saw the new moon last night. However the circumstance would be, if you needed that for Ibbur Shana, if you needed that for setting another month of Nisan, we wouldn't do such a thing, and he says that. So, Lichtenstein says that Al Pi Ha'Re'iyah is the Beit Din. Maybe that's a Beit Din act, and then maybe Al Pi Cheshbon, Ibbur Shana, maybe it's the more, not as a court, but as a representative of the Jewish people, and he goes back to that issue. So you end up having, right? I could have a breezy summary. A breezy summary of this all would be that Hashem gave us control of the calendar, and we get to control it, and that's important to notice. And there's a value in noticing that and seeing that and understanding that. I think what Rav Lichtenstein is trying to show us is that as you pick it apart and as you go into each of the perspectives of it, we see many options for how to understand that control of the calendar, for how to understand how that affects our experience of the holidays and our experience of adding a new month of Adar, and what it means for us as a Jewish people to have sacred time and what it means for us to control that time. In contrast to, for example, Shabbat, which isn't about us controlling time at all. Shabbat is just a part of the makeup of the universe. And God created the world, metaphorically, in 6 days, ended on the seventh, and rested, and made that and marked that in the nature of the world forever. With time, with holiday time, with calendrical time, which remember also that we operate by the moon. Everybody's always noticed that that's different than the non-Jews Jewish world, which operates by a solar calendar for lots of good reasons. We operate by the moon for these same reasons. So this was Rav Lichtenstein's, some of Rav Lichtenstein's investigation of what it means to have sanctified time, what it means that God gave us these rights, and how that works, and who it is who's doing it. If it's special people among us, Rashi, the leaders of the generation, the Ramban, 3 mumchin, a small little court, a big court as a court, or maybe the Jewish people as a whole, and that how affects what we're doing in these days. That's my best summary. I hope it's productive for you. Lichtenstein's article is still out there to learn. There's much more there. as they say on Yom Kippur, more than I've said here is written in the article, and we can learn more about Kiddush HaChodesh. Thanks for joining me.